The candles had barely settled into their holders when Elena Marchetti felt the entire room turn cold. She stood at the altar in a white dress that had been chosen for her, not by her, in a church that smelled of lilies and old stone, and she watched the man she had just married lift his glass to the crowd and speak the words that would follow her for the rest of her life. "She is nobody," Damian Rossi said, his voice calm, almost bored, as if he were commenting on the weather. "Just a name on a contract, nothing more." The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. 200 guests, dressed in black and silver, froze with their glasses raised halfway to their lips. Somewhere near the back, a chair scraped against the marble floor. Elena did not move. She had trained herself, over the last 3 weeks of frantic wedding preparations, not to react to anything Damian Rossi said or did. But this was different. This was public. This was permanent. She kept her spine straight and her chin level, the way her mother had taught her before she died, and she smiled the small, practiced smile of a woman who refuses to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her break. Inside, something cracked, but no one in that church would ever know it. Damian did not look at her again. He turned to his men, the tall figures in dark suits who lined the walls like statues, and raised his glass higher. "To business," he said, and the room erupted into forced applause, the kind that comes from people who are more afraid of silence than they are of insult. Elena had known, in the abstract way that people know about storms before they arrive, that this marriage was not going to be a fairy tale. Her father had died 6 months earlier, leaving behind a mountain of debt to a man named Salvatore Conti, a debt that had somehow transferred, through channels she did not fully understand, into an obligation owed to the Rossi family. She had been told, in a meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes, that marrying Damian Rossi would settle the debt and protect her father's name from further disgrace. She had said yes, because she had no other card left to play. She had not expected cruelty. She had expected coldness, distance, perhaps even indifference. But cruelty, delivered in front of 200 witnesses, was something else entirely. After the ceremony, she was led not to a celebration, but to a car, a long black vehicle, with tinted windows that swallowed the last of the evening light. Damian sat across from her, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on something outside the window that she could not see. He did not speak. She did not ask him to. The estate, when they arrived, was enormous and silent, the kind of silence that comes from a house too big for the people living in it. Stone walls, high windows, gardens that stretched into darkness. A woman with gray hair and sharp eyes met them at the door. "This is Lucia," Damian said, the first words he had spoken to Elena directly since the church. "She runs the house. You will listen to her." "I have a name," Elena said quietly, the first words she had spoken back to him. "It is Elena." Damian's eyes flicked to her, something unreadable passing behind them, and then he turned and walked away down a long corridor without another word, his footsteps echoing off the stone until they faded into nothing. Lucia watched him go, then turned to Elena with an expression that was not quite sympathy, but was not quite hostility either. "Come," she said, "I will show you to your room." The room was beautiful, in the way that hotel rooms are beautiful, tasteful, and expensive, and utterly without warmth. Elena sat on the edge of the enormous bed after Lucia left, and for the first time since the church, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Her hands trembled, her throat ached, but she did not cry. She had promised herself, standing at that altar, that she would not give this family the satisfaction of her tears. Instead, she stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the gardens below, dark shapes of hedges and fountains under a sky just beginning to show stars. Somewhere in this house was a man who had humiliated her in front of everyone she would now be expected to call family, and she intended to understand why before she allowed herself to be broken by it. The first week passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Damian left early each morning and returned late each night, and on the rare occasions their paths crossed in the halls, he offered nothing more than a brief nod, as if she were a guest he tolerated, rather than a wife he had chosen. Elena spent her days exploring the estate, memorizing its corridors, learning the names of the staff who worked there. She was, she realized quickly, the only person in the house who spoke to the servants as equals rather than as furniture. and this small kindness began, slowly, to earn her something valuable: information. It was a young groundskeeper named Daniel who first told her, in a hushed voice while trimming the roses near the east wall, that Damien had not always been so cold. Before his father died, Daniel said, not looking up from his work, he used to laugh. I remember it. Not much, but sometimes. He glanced around before continuing. Something changed him. Nobody talks about it. Elena filed the information away and said nothing. But that night, lying awake in the vast, empty bed, she found herself wondering what kind of man Damien Rossi had been before whatever had hardened him into the one who had called her nobody, in front of 200 people. It was Lucia, in the end, who gave her the clearest picture, though she gave it reluctantly, and only after Elena had spent 2 weeks proving herself patient, respectful, and unwilling to complain. They sat together one evening in the kitchen, the warmest room in the entire estate, while Lucia prepared bread for the following morning. You want to know why he is the way he is, Lucia said, not a question. I want to understand, Elena corrected gently. There is a difference. Lucia's hands paused over the dough. His mother left when he was 12. His father raised him to believe that love was a weakness men in this family could not afford. When his father died 3 years ago, Damien became head of everything, all at once, far too young, with enemies circling before the funeral flowers had even wilted. She resumed kneading, harder now. He learned to show nothing, to no one. It is not an excuse for what he said to you, but it is a reason. Elena turned the words over in her mind for days afterward. They did not erase the humiliation of the wedding, but they began to shift something in how she saw the man she had married. Cruelty born of calculation was one thing. Cruelty born of fear, dressed up as strength, was another. She found herself, in the days that followed, watching Damien with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle with half its pieces missing. She noticed how the men who worked for him grew quiet whenever he entered a room, not from fear exactly, but from a kind of reverence mixed with caution, as though they were all waiting for a storm that might or might not arrive. She noticed how he never sat with his back to a door, how his eyes moved constantly to the windows and exits of any room he entered, a habit so ingrained it seemed less like a decision and more like breathing. One afternoon, while wandering the gardens alone, she came across an old photograph left forgotten on a stone bench near the fountain, half hidden beneath a fallen leaf. It showed a much younger Damien, perhaps 10 years old, standing beside a woman with the same dark eyes he had inherited, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Elena stared at the photograph for a long time before slipping it into her pocket, unsure why she felt the need to keep it safe, only certain that it revealed something about him that the cold, composed man in the house upstairs had long since buried. She asked Lucia about the woman that evening, and the older woman's face grew guarded in a way Elena had not seen before. That is his mother, Lucia said quietly, glancing toward the door as though worried someone might overhear. She left when he was 12 years old. Some say she simply could not bear the life this family demanded of her. Others say she was given no choice in the matter at all. What happened to her? Elena asked. Nobody speaks of it, Lucia said, taking the photograph gently from Elena's hands and setting it aside. And you would do well not to ask him directly. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The warning settled uneasily in Elena's mind, another piece of the puzzle that refused to fit cleanly alongside the others. She began to wonder, lying awake in her cold, unfamiliar bed each night, whether the cruelty Damien had shown her at the wedding was simply the latest expression of a wound that had never properly healed. A boy who had learned far too young that the people meant to love him could vanish without warning, and who had built his entire adult life around never allowing himself to be that vulnerable again. It did not excuse what he had done. She reminded herself of that fact every time her sympathy threatened to soften into something gentler, but it gave her, for the first time, a framework for understanding the man she had married, rather than simply enduring him. She began, without quite deciding to, paying closer attention to Damien himself. She noticed the way his shoulders tensed whenever a certain name was mentioned in passing by his men, a name that seemed to belong to the Conti family, the same family her late father had owed money to. She noticed that he rarely ate a full meal, that he slept, if he slept at all, for only a few hours before dawn. She noticed that despite his coldness toward her, he had quietly instructed Lucia to make sure Elena's room was always kept warm, that the kitchen always had the specific tea her mother used to make, information he could only have learned by asking someone, though he had never asked Elena anything himself. Small contradictions, small cracks in the ice. She did not know yet what they meant, but she began, carefully, to collect them. There were other members of the household she came to know during those early weeks, each one offering a small fragment of the larger picture she was slowly assembling. There was Grace, an older woman who tended the estate's small chapel, and had known Damien's late father personally, who spoke of the family with a loyalty so absolute it bordered on devotion, yet who also occasionally let slip small, telling details about the price that loyalty had demanded over the years. There was Nathan, one of the younger guards stationed near the main gate, barely older than Elena herself, who treated her with a shy kindness that reminded her she was not the only person in this house, still learning where she belonged. It was Nathan, in fact, who first told her about the strange, unspoken rule that governed the estate, one that no one had bothered to explain to her directly. No one was permitted to mention Damien's mother in his presence, under any circumstance. The rule had apparently been established the week after she left, enforced without exception by Damien's father until his death, and continued since then, out of habit, as much as fear. Nobody wants to be the one who reminds him, Nathan admitted quietly one afternoon, as Elena walked the perimeter of the gardens under his watchful escort. He does not shout. He does not lose his temper. He simply goes very still, and very quiet, and somehow that is worse than any anger could be. Elena filed this away alongside everything else, building a picture of a man whose coldness was not simply inherited, but carefully constructed, brick by brick, around a wound that had never been permitted to heal properly. She began to understand, slowly, that the cruelty at the wedding had not been an isolated cruelty at all, but a symptom of something far larger, a lifetime spent learning that showing care for another person was the surest way to lose them. It did not make the wound Damien had inflicted on her hurt any less, but it began to change the question she was asking herself each night before sleep. She had started, in the beginning, by asking herself how she could possibly survive a marriage to a man who had humiliated her so publicly. Now, increasingly, she found herself asking a different question entirely, whether survival alone was truly the limit of what this strange, guarded, wounded man might eventually be capable of offering her, if she was patient enough, and brave enough, to wait and see. The days continued to pass in their careful, distant rhythm, Damien gone before she woke, and returning long after she had given up waiting for him at dinner. But Elena noticed, in small ways she could not quite prove, that something in the house had begun to shift. The tea that appeared in her room each evening arrived a few minutes earlier than before. The fire in her room was lit before the evening chill fully set in, rather than after. Small mercies, unacknowledged and unexplained, that she suspected, without any real evidence, had originated from instructions Damien had quietly given, without ever mentioning them to her directly. She did not know, yet, what to make of any of it, but she found herself, against every instinct built from that humiliating night at the altar, beginning to watch the door each evening with something that felt dangerously close to hope. 3 weeks into the marriage, Elena was summoned, for the first time, to Damien's study. She walked the long corridor, with her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit, unsure whether she was about to be dismissed from the house entirely, or given some new instruction to obey. She found him standing at the window, his back to the door, a glass of amber liquid untouched on the desk beside him. "You have been talking to my staff," he said, without turning around. "I have been living in this house," Elena replied evenly. "Talking to the people in it seems reasonable." He turned then, and for the first time since the wedding, he looked at her directly, fully, as though truly seeing her. "This is not a house for making friends, Elena. It is a house for surviving." "Then I intend to survive it," she said, holding his gaze. "But I refuse to do it in silence, pretending I am furniture, the way you seem to want." Something shifted in his expression, so briefly she almost missed it. A flicker of surprise, perhaps even reluctant respect. "You are not what I expected," he said quietly. "You never gave yourself the chance to expect anything. Elena said. You decided who I was before I ever walked through that door. He did not answer. He turned back to the window, and after a long moment of silence, Elena understood that the conversation, such as it was, had ended. She left the study with more questions than she had entered with, but for the first time, she also left with the sense that the wall between them, however thick, was not entirely without a door. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered down to the library on the ground floor, drawn by the single lamp still burning behind its heavy doors. She found Damien there, alone, a stack of papers spread across the table in front of him, his expression tired in a way she had not seen before, the mask he wore during the day worn thin by exhaustion. He did not send her away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. My father built this family on fear, he said finally, not looking up from the papers. He taught me that the moment you show softness, someone uses it against you. He was right, more times than I can count. He finally raised his eyes to hers. That night, at the wedding. I said what I said because Salvatore Conti was in that room, watching, waiting for any sign that you mattered to me. If he believed you were nobody to me, he would have no reason to use you against me. Elena felt the breath leave her chest slowly. You could have told me, warned me. Instead, you let me stand there and be humiliated in front of everyone I will now have to face for the rest of my life. I know, Damien said, and for the first time, his voice cracked, just slightly, just enough. I am not asking you to forgive it. I am only telling you why. Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for the lie she expected to find, and not finding it. That is not enough, she said finally. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. I understand, Damien said quietly. She turned to leave, but at the door she paused, looking back at him one last time. But it is a beginning, she said, and I did not think I would get even that much from you. She left him there among his papers, and his fear disguised as strength, and as she climbed the stairs back to her cold, beautiful room, she found herself thinking, for the first time since the church, not about the humiliation of the wedding, but about the man who had delivered it, and the fear that had driven him to it. It was not forgiveness. It was not even close. But it was, she realized, the first true thing he had ever said to her, and in a house built entirely on lies and silence that felt like something worth holding on to. The scream came from the east wing before dawn, sharp and short, cut off almost as soon as it began, and Elena was out of bed and running down the corridor before she had even fully processed the sound. She found Lucia standing frozen outside the kitchen door, her face pale in the gray morning light, staring at a broken window and a single black rose left on the counter where the morning bread should have been rising. It is a message, Lucia whispered when Elena reached her side, from the Conti family. Elena's blood went cold. She had learned enough in her first weeks in this house to know that a black rose from the Countess was not decoration, it was a warning. Within minutes, the house was awake and moving, men in dark suits appearing from rooms Elena had not even known were occupied, voices low and urgent in the hallways. Damien arrived last, fully dressed despite the early hour, his face carved from stone, as he examined the broken window and the rose without touching either. They are testing how close they can get, he said to Victor, his cousin, and second in command, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, who had barely spoken 2 words to Elena since the wedding. Double the men on the perimeter. No one enters or leaves without my knowledge. And her? Victor asked, tilting his head toward Elena, as though she were an object to be accounted for, rather than a person in the room. Damien's eyes moved to Elena for the first time since arriving. Something passed behind them, calculation perhaps, or something closer to concern, though he buried it quickly beneath his usual composure. She stays close to the house, he said, no exceptions. Elena bristled at being discussed as though she could not speak for herself, but she said nothing, filing the moment away with all the others. There would be a time to challenge him on his habit of deciding things for her. This was not it. Over the following days, the tension in the house grew thick enough to taste. Elena found herself drawn, almost against her will, into the rhythms of the family business, not because anyone invited her, but because she refused to sit quietly in her room, while decisions that affected her life were made without her, in rooms she was not permitted to enter. She began reading the newspapers Damien discarded each morning, learning the names of businesses connected to the Rossi family, the shipping routes, the warehouses, the delicate web of alliances and rivalries that kept the whole enterprise standing. It was during one of these quiet mornings, sitting alone in the library, with a newspaper spread across her lap, that she overheard a conversation that changed everything. Victor's voice, low and urgent, came from the study next door, the connecting wall thin enough to carry sound when the house was otherwise silent. "The shipment on Thursday," he was saying. "If Conti's men know the route, we lose everything in that container. 3 million, gone in one night." "Then we change the route," Damien said. "There is no time to change it without alerting our own drivers to the fact that something is wrong," Victor said. "If word gets back to Conti that we suspect a leak, he will know we are onto him." Elena set down the newspaper slowly, her mind working faster than she expected. She thought of the shipping manifests she had glimpsed on Damien's desk weeks earlier, the pattern of dates and routes that had seemed, at the time, like meaningless numbers. Now, with the context Victor had just supplied, they resolved into something else entirely, a pattern that suggested not one leak but two, a discrepancy between the official route and a secondary route, buried in older paperwork that nobody seemed to be using anymore. She knocked on the study door before she could talk herself out of it. Both men turned as she entered, Victor's expression sharpening with irritation, Damien's carefully unreadable. "This is not the time, Elena," Damien said. "I think it is exactly the time," she said, stepping fully into the room, despite the clear discomfort on both their faces. "I heard what you said about Thursday's shipment. I think I know how Conti's men are getting the route information." Victor let out a short, humorless laugh. "With respect, this is not something you understand." "Then explain it to me, and let me prove I do," Elena said evenly, refusing to back down under his glare. "6 weeks ago, I saw manifests on this desk, showing 2 different routes for the same cargo. One current, one from an older filing system. If someone inside your organization still has access to that old system, they could be selling information without ever touching the current documents you are watching so carefully." Silence fell over the room. Victor's irritation faded slowly into something more thoughtful, and Damien's eyes had sharpened with an intensity Elena had not seen from him before, not since the wedding. "The old logistics office," Damien said slowly, almost to himself. "We never fully shut down the archive system when we switched vendors last year." "Someone still has credentials," Elena said. "Someone who has not needed to touch the new system at all, because they never stopped using the old one." Victor was already moving toward the door, pulling out his phone, calling for records to be pulled immediately. Damien remained where he was, studying Elena with an expression she could not quite name, something between surprise and reluctant admiration. "How did you know to look at that?" he asked quietly, once Victor had left the room. "I read everything you leave lying around," Elena said simply. "I have very little else to occupy my time in this house since I am not permitted to leave it." A ghost of something that might have been amusement crossed his face, gone almost before it appeared. "You continue to surprise me," he said. "You continue to underestimate me," she replied. "It seems to be a habit of yours." "A habit I am beginning to break," Damien admitted, and there was something almost self-deprecating in his tone, a rare crack of humor that Elena had not expected from him. "My father would have called what you just did dangerous. A woman with too much curiosity," he would have said, "is a woman who eventually becomes a liability." "And what would you call it?" Elena asked, watching him carefully. Damien considered the question for a long moment, his eyes moving over the newspaper still clutched in her hands, the careful notes she had made in the margins where numbers did not align the way they should. "I would call it exactly what it is," he said finally. "An asset I did not know I had, and one I should have recognized far sooner than I did." He did not argue the point. Instead, for the first time since the wedding, he gestured to the chair across from his desk, an invitation rather than a dismissal. "Sit," he said. "Tell me what else you have noticed." Word of the incident spread quickly through the household, and Elena noticed, in the days that followed, a subtle shift in how the staff treated her. Where before she had been an outsider tolerated out of necessity, she began to sense something closer to curiosity, even cautious respect, in the glances that followed her through the halls. Lucia, in particular, began seeking her out more often, finding small excuses to share a cup of tea in the kitchen each afternoon, filling in details about the family's history that helped Elena understand the delicate architecture of loyalties and grudges that held the household together. Victor has never trusted outsiders, Lucia told her one afternoon, kneading dough with practiced hands while Elena chopped vegetables beside her, a task she had insisted on learning, despite Lucia's initial protests that a woman in her position should not be working in the kitchen. His own wife left him years ago, took their daughter with her, back to her family in the north. He has not spoken of it since, but I believe it changed how he sees every new person who enters this house. He expects betrayal before he expects loyalty. That explains a great deal, Elena said, thinking of the guarded suspicion in Victor's eyes each time they had spoken. He will come around, Lucia said, with the quiet confidence of someone who had watched this family weather many storms. He came around to trusting Damien's father, eventually, after years of doubt. Give him time, and prove yourself as you have already begun to do, and he will see what the rest of us are beginning to see. Elena did not ask what, exactly, the rest of the household was beginning to see, though she suspected she already knew, and the thought left her feeling something she was not yet ready to name. It became, over the following days, an unlikely rhythm between them. Elena would spend her mornings reading whatever documents Damien left unguarded, and in the evenings, once the house had quieted, she would find him in the study and share whatever patterns she had noticed, whatever inconsistencies had caught her attention. He listened, at first reluctantly, then with growing attentiveness, and slowly, without either of them acknowledging it directly, the wall between them began to thin. The leak, when they found it, turned out to be a mid-level accountant named Simon, who had worked for the family for over a decade, a man nobody had suspected because he had never given anyone reason to. Victor wanted him handled the old way, swiftly and without mercy, but Elena, standing quietly in the corner of the study during the discussion, spoke up before Damien could give the order. If you make him disappear, she said, Conti will know you found the leak, and he will simply find another way in. But if you let him go, quietly, with a story that he resigned to care for a sick relative, Conti will not know you discovered anything. You will have removed the threat without revealing that you know how it worked. Victor looked ready to argue, but Damien held up a hand, silencing him. He studied Elena for a long moment, and then he nodded, slowly. Do it her way, he said. It was a small thing, in the scope of everything happening around them, but it marked something significant nonetheless. For the first time since the wedding, Damien Rossi had chosen Elena's judgment over his own instinct, in front of the man who was supposed to be his most trusted advisor. Victor's expression, as he left the room, was a mixture of frustration and something that might have been the beginning of respect. 2 days later, word came back that Simon had accepted the story of a sick relative without protest, quietly clearing out his desk and departing the family's employ with none of the panic or violence Victor had originally predicted. Elena watched from the study window as he carried a single box of belongings to a waiting taxi, and she felt an unexpected pang of something like sympathy, quickly overtaken by the colder understanding that this man had been willing to sell information that could have gotten people killed, herself potentially among them. Damien found her still standing at the window after the taxi had disappeared down the long gravel drive. You look troubled, he observed, coming to stand beside her. I keep thinking about what might have happened, Elena admitted, if we had not found the pattern in time. If Conti's men had been waiting at that warehouse on Thursday, instead of walking into an empty trap. We did find it in time, Damien said. Because of you. Because we worked together, Elena corrected gently. That is different from simply crediting me alone. Damien studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful passing behind his eyes. My father never worked with anyone, he said finally. He commanded, and others obeyed, and he called that leadership. I am beginning to wonder if he simply never learned what real partnership could accomplish, because he never trusted anyone enough to attempt it. Do you trust me? Elena asked quietly, the question slipping out before she had fully decided to ask it. Damien did not answer immediately, and for a moment, Elena feared she had pushed too far, too quickly. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of sincerity she had not expected. "More than I trust anyone else in this house," he said, "which frightens me more than I am willing to admit." "Why does it frighten you?" she pressed. "Because trust, in my experience, is the surest way to be hurt," Damien said quietly. "My mother taught me that lesson before I was old enough to understand it fully. I have spent my whole life avoiding a repeat of that particular education." Elena said nothing, sensing that he had revealed more than he intended, and unwilling to push him further than he was ready to go. Instead, she simply reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the windowsill, a small gesture of comfort that he did not pull away from, and for a long moment, they stood together in silence, watching the empty driveway where the taxi had long since disappeared. That night, Elena found herself unable to sleep, her mind replaying the events of the past week, the strange, unexpected partnership that had formed between herself and the man who had humiliated her at their wedding. She rose and walked, as she often did now, toward the library, expecting to find it empty at this hour. Instead, she found Damien standing at the window, the same posture as the night he had first explained himself to her, but something in his shoulders was different now, less guarded. "I keep thinking about what you said," he told her, without turning around. "About my father. About fear disguised as strength." "I did not say that to hurt you," Elena said, moving to stand beside him at the window. "I know," he said. "That is what makes it hard to forget." He turned to look at her, and in the dim light of the library, his face was unguarded, in a way she had never seen before. "My father would have handled Simon the way Victor wanted. Quickly, without a second thought. I have spent 3 years trying to be exactly like him, because I believed that was the only way to keep this family alive. And now?" Elena asked quietly. "Now I am not so certain," he admitted. "You saw something none of us saw, not because you know this business better than we do, but because you think about consequences differently. My father taught me to strike first, and think later. You think first, and it makes you dangerous, in a way I did not expect from someone I called nobody, in front of everyone I know." The words hung between them, heavy with everything neither of them had said aloud. Elena did not offer forgiveness. Not yet. But she did not walk away either. "I am not nobody," she said quietly. "No," Damien agreed, his voice low. "You are not. I think I have known that for some time now. I was simply too afraid to admit it, even to myself." Outside, the gardens lay dark and silent under a sky heavy with clouds, and somewhere beyond the estate walls, Salvatore Conti was almost certainly already planning his next move. But inside the library, for just a moment, the war outside felt distant, replaced by something quieter and far more complicated, something neither of them was ready to name, but that neither of them could deny was beginning to take root. Before Elena finally returned to her own room that night, Damien walked her to the door, an old-fashioned courtesy that felt strangely tender coming from a man who had built his entire life around never showing softness to anyone. At the threshold he paused, studying her face in the dim hallway light, as though searching for something he had not allowed himself to look for before. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Elena asked. "For refusing to let me remain the man I was pretending to be," he said. "It would have been easier for you to accept my coldness, and simply endure this marriage in silence, the way I expected you to. Instead you fought back, every single time, and I find that I am grateful for it, even when it unsettles me." "I did not fight back to unsettle you," Elena said. "I fought back because I refused to disappear into the role you assigned me." "I know," Damien said quietly. "That is precisely why it worked." He left her at her door with nothing more than that admission, but Elena carried the weight of his words with her, long after she had closed the door behind her, turning them over in her mind, as she finally drifted toward an uneasy, hopeful sleep. Gunfire shattered the quiet of the estate at 2 in the morning, and Elena was thrown from sleep by the sound of Lucia pounding on her bedroom door, shouting her name with a panic she had never heard from the older woman before. Elena grabbed a robe and ran, her bare feet cold against the stone floor, following Lucia down the servants' staircase, toward the lower level of the house, where Damien had built a reinforced room years earlier, back when his father was still alive, and threats like this were a regular occurrence. "What is happening?" Elena demanded, as Lucia pulled her through a heavy steel door that closed behind them with a sound like a vault sealing shut. "Conti's men," Lucia said, her voice shaking. "They came over the east wall. Damien and Victor are with the guards now." Elena's heart pounded against her ribs as the muffled sound of gunfire continued somewhere above and beyond them, distant but unmistakable. She thought of Damien out there, exposed, and found herself gripped by a fear so sharp it startled her, a fear that had nothing to do with her own safety and everything to do with his. The minutes stretched unbearably long. Elena paced the small reinforced room while Lucia sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, praying under her breath in a language Elena did not recognize. When the door finally opened, nearly 20 minutes later, it was Victor who appeared first, blood on his sleeve, though he waved off Elena's concern, insisting it was not his own. "Where is Damien?" Elena asked immediately, her voice sharper than she intended. "Securing the perimeter," Victor said. "The attack has been pushed back. Conti's men are retreating." He paused, studying her face with an expression she could not quite read. "He asked me to make sure you were safe first, before he would come down himself." Something in Elena's chest tightened at those words, an unfamiliar warmth threading through the fear that still gripped her. She did not have time to examine the feeling before Damien himself appeared in the doorway, his jacket torn, a shallow cut along his jaw, but otherwise, mercifully, unharmed. Elena crossed the room before she could stop herself, her hands finding his face, tilting it toward the light to examine the cut. "You are hurt," she said, her voice unsteady. "It is nothing," Damien said, though he did not pull away from her touch, and for a long moment, neither of them moved, the chaos of the attack outside, forgotten in the small space between them. "You could have died," Elena whispered. "I did not," Damien said quietly. "You made sure of that, in a way. Your suggestion about false records, weeks ago, when you insisted we plant misleading information about our vulnerable points, in case anyone was still watching our systems. It sent Conti's men to the wrong section of the estate tonight. They expected weak defenses at the east wall. They found Victor waiting instead." Elena had nearly forgotten the small precaution she had suggested during one of their late-night conversations in the library, a minor detail in a much larger conversation about security. She had not realized, until this moment, how much weight her instincts had begun to carry in decisions that affected all of their lives. "I am glad it worked," she said softly. "So am I," Damien said, and something in his voice carried a weight far beyond the words themselves. They remained there a moment longer, the small reinforced room, still smelling faintly of dust and steel, before Lucia gently cleared her throat, reminding them both that they were not alone. Elena stepped back, color rising in her cheeks, though Damien's eyes lingered on her a moment longer, before he turned to address the practical matters still demanding his attention, the wounded to check on, the perimeter to fully secure, the inevitable reckoning with what this attack meant for the fragile peace they had all been hoping might hold a little longer. Later that night, once the house had finally settled into an uneasy quiet, Elena found herself unable to sleep, replaying the moment Damien had walked through that door, injured but alive, and the flood of relief that had overtaken her before she could stop herself from reaching for him. She had not expected, when she married him, to ever feel anything close to that kind of fear for his safety. It unsettled her more than the attack itself had. She rose eventually and made her way to the kitchen, hoping a cup of tea might ease her restless mind, and found Damien already there, sitting alone at the long wooden table, with a cup of his own, untouched in front of him, the cut along his jaw now cleaned and bandaged. "You should be resting," Elena said, taking the seat across from him without waiting to be invited. "So should you," he replied, though he did not ask her to leave. They sat together in silence for a while, the kind of silence that no longer felt uncomfortable between them, before Damien finally spoke again. "I keep thinking about what you said, in the reinforced room, before I fully arrived, that you were afraid I might die." "I was," Elena admitted quietly. "I did not expect that," Damien said. "Not from you, not after everything I put you through at the beginning." Neither did I, Elena said honestly. But it seems the past 3 months have changed more than I realized, for both of us. The morning after the attack, Elena walked the grounds with Nathan, surveying the damage to the east wall, where Conti's men had breached the perimeter. Broken glass still glittered in the grass, and a scorch mark stained the stone near the servants' entrance, where a small fire had been quickly extinguished before it could spread. Nathan walked beside her in silence for a long while, before finally speaking. "I heard what you did," he said, "convincing Damien to plant false records about our defenses. If you had not thought of that, we might all have been standing in the wrong place last night." "I only offered a suggestion," Elena said, though something in his words settled warmly in her chest, despite the exhaustion weighing on her. "A suggestion that saved lives," Nathan said simply. "Victor is already saying so, to anyone who will listen." Elena had not expected praise from Victor, of all people, and she found herself turning the compliment over in her mind for the rest of the day, uncertain how to reconcile it with the cold suspicion he had shown her only weeks earlier. It was Lucia, unsurprisingly, who offered the clearest explanation that evening, as the two of them prepared a simple meal together in the kitchen, while the rest of the household worked to repair the damage from the previous night. "Victor does not give trust easily," Lucia said, "but he gives credit fairly, even to people he has not yet decided to trust completely. That is more than most men in his position would offer." "It still surprises me," Elena admitted. "You have surprised everyone in this house," Lucia said, with a small, knowing smile. "Including, I think, the man you married." In the days that followed the attack, the house settled into a new kind of rhythm, more cautious, more alert, but also, strangely, warmer than before. Damien no longer disappeared for entire days without a word to Elena. He began seeking her opinion openly, in front of Victor and the other men, no longer hiding their conversations behind closed study doors. Victor's initial resistance softened into something like reluctant respect, and even Lucia, who had watched the marriage begin in humiliation, began to speak of Elena with something close to pride. It was during this fragile period of calm that Elena finally learned the full truth of what had happened at her father's death, information Damien had kept from her since the wedding, though she suspected now it was not out of cruelty, but out of some misguided attempt to protect her. They sat together in the garden one afternoon, the first time either of them had ventured outside the walls of the estate since the attack, under close guard, but finally free of the suffocating stone corridors. Damien was quiet for a long time before he spoke. "Your father's debt was never truly to my family," he said finally. "It was to Conti. My father acquired it from him 2 years ago, as part of a larger deal, a way of gaining leverage over territory Conti wanted." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Then the marriage was never about settling a debt to your family at all?" "No," Damien admitted. "It was about denying Conti the leverage he wanted over your father's shipping contacts that would have given him access to routes into our territory. Marrying you sealed those contacts under Rossi protection instead. My father arranged it before he died. I inherited the arrangement, along with everything else." "And you never thought to tell me any of this," Elena said, her voice tight with something between anger and hurt. "I did not know how," Damien said quietly. "How do you explain to a woman that her marriage was a business transaction designed to keep information out of a dangerous man's hands, without making her feel exactly the way I made her feel at the wedding? I told myself silence was protection. I understand now that it was simply another kind of cruelty." Elena sat with the information for a long moment, watching the late afternoon light fall through the leaves above them. She thought of her father, of the desperate final months of his life, when he had grown thin and quiet, with worry he refused to explain to her, and she understood, finally, the full weight of what he had been trying to protect her from. "He knew," she said softly. "My father knew what Conti wanted from him. That is why he never told me anything either." "I believe he did," Damien said. "I believe he chose the Rossi family specifically because he trusted we would honor the arrangement, rather than exploit it." "And have you?" Elena asked, turning to look at him directly. "Honored it?" Damien held her gaze without flinching. "I called you nobody, in front of everyone I know," he said. "I do not believe that is honor. But everything since then, Every decision I have made about your safety, about your place in this house, about the respect you have earned from men who respect almost no one, that has been an attempt to correct what I got wrong at the very beginning. It was, Elena realized, the closest thing to an apology he had offered since that first night in the library, and something about the honesty in his voice, the lack of excuse or deflection, loosened something in her chest that had been tightly wound since the moment he had spoken those cruel words at the altar. "It is not enough," she said, echoing the words she had spoken to him weeks earlier, "but it matters." "I know," Damien said. "I do not expect it to be enough. I only hope that, given enough time, it might become something closer to that." That evening, as the sun set behind the estate walls, Victor approached Elena privately in the hallway outside her room, an unusual gesture given his initial coldness toward her. "I owe you an apology," he said, without preamble. "When you first came into this family, I believed you were exactly what Damien said you were at the wedding, a nobody, a complication, a weakness we would need to manage. I was wrong." "Thank you for saying so," Elena said, genuinely surprised. "I mean it," Victor continued, leaning against the doorframe with an ease she had not seen from him before. "I have served this family since I was younger than Nathan, out there at the gate. I watched Damien's father build an empire on fear, and I watched what it cost him in the end. A son who flinched whenever anyone spoke of love, as though it were a foreign language he had never learned to speak. I did not think anyone could reach him. I am beginning to think I was wrong." "He is trying," Elena said carefully, unwilling to overstate what still felt fragile and uncertain between herself and Damien. "Trying is more than his father ever managed," Victor said. "That alone is worth acknowledging." He straightened, preparing to continue down the hallway, then paused, looking back at her with an expression that was almost gentle. "For what it is worth, Elena, I do not believe your father's debt required anything close to what you have given this family. Whatever arrangement brought you here, I believe you have long since become something this house needed far more than it needed the settlement of an old obligation." He left her standing alone in the corridor, with his words settling slowly over her, and it was several minutes before she found herself able to move again, the weight of his unexpected kindness lingering long after he had disappeared around the corner. "He has changed since you arrived," Victor continued, his voice quieter now. "I do not know if he sees it himself, but the rest of us do. He listens now, where before he only commanded. He considers consequences, where before he only reacted. Whatever debt his father intended you to settle, I believe you have already repaid it many times over, simply by being here." Elena did not know how to respond to such an admission, coming from a man who had barely acknowledged her existence for the first weeks of her marriage. She only nodded, and Victor, seemingly satisfied that his message had been delivered, continued down the hallway and left her alone with her thoughts. That night, lying in the enormous bed that had felt so cold and unfamiliar on her wedding night, Elena found herself thinking not of the humiliation that had marked the beginning of her marriage, but of the strange, unexpected trust that had grown in its place. She did not yet know if it was enough to call it forgiveness. But she understood, finally, that whatever this marriage had become, it was no longer the empty contract it had started as. Somewhere between the black rose and the gunfire, and the quiet conversations in the library, something real had begun to grow, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably there. She only hoped, as she finally drifted toward sleep, that it would survive whatever Salvatore Conti still had planned for them. In the morning, she woke to find a small, folded note left on the table beside her bed, unsigned, but written in handwriting she had come to recognize from the margins of shipping manifests and business correspondence scattered across Damien's desk. It contained only a single line: "Thank you for staying, even when I gave you every reason to leave." She read it 3 times before tucking it carefully into the drawer beside her bed, alongside the old photograph of Damien's mother, 2 fragile pieces of a man slowly learning how to be known. She did not mention the note to him directly, sensing that he had not intended for her to acknowledge it aloud, but she found herself humming quietly as she dressed that morning, a lightness in her chest that had been entirely absent during those first difficult weeks in this house. Whatever storm Salvatore Conti still had waiting for them, she felt, for the first time since her wedding day, that she would not be facing it alone. The note arrived wrapped around a stone thrown through the kitchen window, shattering glass across the counter, where Lucia had been kneading bread only moments before. Elena reached it first, her hands trembling as she unfolded the paper and read the words written in sharp, deliberate handwriting. Bring her to the old harbor warehouse by midnight, alone, or the next message will not be a warning. She did not need to ask who had sent it. She ran through the house calling for Damien, the note clutched tightly in her fist, her heart hammering against her ribs with a fear that had nothing to do with herself, and everything to do with what Conti intended to do to secure his revenge. Damien read the note twice, his face growing paler with each pass, and when he finally looked up at her, the composure he had spent years perfecting had cracked entirely, replaced by something raw and desperate that Elena had never seen from him before. He wants to trade you for territory, Damien said, his voice tight. He believes if he takes you, I will hand over everything my father built rather than lose you. Then don't go, Elena said immediately. Ignore it. Let him make the next move. He already has, Damien said grimly, and it was only then that Elena noticed Victor was missing from the room, that no one had seen him since early that morning. Word came within the hour that Victor's car had been found abandoned near the old fishing docks, the door left open, his phone shattered on the pavement beside it. Damien stared at the photograph one of his men had taken at the scene, his hands trembling with a fury Elena had never witnessed from him before, a fury that seemed to burn hotter for the fear buried underneath it. This is my fault, he said quietly, almost to himself. I should have seen this coming. Conti would never simply retreat after losing his informant. He needed a new piece to bargain with. Blaming yourself will not bring Victor home any faster, Elena said, placing a steadying hand on his arm. We need a plan, not guilt. Damien looked at her then, something shifting behind his eyes, the fury tempering into a colder, more focused resolve. You are right, he said. Gather everyone. We plan this properly, together, or we do not go at all. The next hour passed in a blur of frantic preparation, men moving through the house with weapons and grim expressions, Damien barking orders with an intensity that left no room for argument. Elena, refusing to be sidelined, insisted on being part of the planning, and though Damien's instinct was clearly to lock her away in the reinforced room and leave her there until the crisis passed, something in her expression must have convinced him that such a plan would fail before it began. If you take me there as bait, we control the terms, Elena said, laying out the plan with a steadiness that surprised even her. If Conti believes he has what he wants, he will be less cautious. You use that moment. It is too dangerous, Damien said, but the argument in his voice had already begun to weaken, and Elena recognized the particular quality of his hesitation. Not doubt in her judgment, but fear for her safety, a fear he had never allowed himself to show so plainly before. I am already in danger, Elena said gently, taking his hand in both of hers. The only question is whether I face it beside you, or wait helplessly in a locked room, while you face it alone. I choose beside you. Damien's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing, simply searching her face as though trying to memorize it against some fear he could not voice aloud. If anything happens to you, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, I do not know what I would become. Nothing will happen, Elena said, with more confidence than she truly felt. Not if we are careful, not if we trust each other. The drive to the harbor passed in tense silence, the city lights giving way slowly to the darker, quieter stretches near the water, where warehouses stood like sleeping giants against the night sky. Elena sat beside Damien in the back of the car, her hand still held tightly in his, both of them rehearsing the plan in their minds one final time. Whatever happens in there, Damien said quietly, breaking the silence as the car slowed near the harbor's edge, I need you to trust the men positioned outside. They will not fail us. I trust you, Elena said simply. That is enough for me to trust everything that follows from it. Damien turned to look at her, something raw and unguarded passing across his face in the dim light of the car's interior. 3 months ago, I would not have believed a woman could say those words to me and mean them, he said. I do not deserve how easily you have given me that trust, after everything. You have earned more of it than you realize, Elena said softly. Tonight, we prove it further. The car came to a stop a short distance from the warehouse, and as they stepped out into the cold night air, the weight of what was about to happen settled fully over both of them. The fragile trust they had built over 3 difficult months about to be tested in the most dangerous way either of them had yet faced. The warehouse, when they arrived just before midnight, stood dark and silent against the harbor's black water, the kind of silence that felt deliberately arranged rather than natural. Elena walked beside Damien toward the entrance, flanked by his men, positioned carefully out of sight, every step calculated according to the plan they had built together over the preceding hours. Salvatore Conti waited inside, a tall man with silver hair and cold eyes, flanked by his own guards, and beside him, bound and bruised but alive, stood Victor, his expression a mixture of fury and relief at the sight of them arriving. "You came," Conti said, sounding almost surprised, as though he had expected Damien to abandon his cousin to save himself the trouble. "And you brought her. How thoughtful." "Release Victor," Damien said, his voice carrying an authority Elena had not heard from him before, cold and absolute. "And this ends now, without further bloodshed." Conti laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the warehouse's high metal walls. "It ends when I have what your father took from me. Territory, respect, and now perhaps, this pretty wife of yours, as a reminder of what happens when the Rossi family forgets its place." Elena felt Damien tense beside her, his hand tightening around hers, and she understood, in that moment, that everything they had built over the past 3 months, the trust, the fragile beginnings of love, hung entirely on what happened in the next few minutes. "You are wrong about one thing," Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her, drawing every eye in the warehouse toward her. "I am not a reminder of anything. I am not a piece to be traded between men who think they own the world simply because they hold guns." Conti's eyes narrowed, clearly unaccustomed to being addressed so directly by anyone, let alone a woman he had intended as leverage. "You have more courage than sense," he said. "I have both, in equal measure," Elena replied, her voice remaining steady despite the guards surrounding them on every side. "Enough courage to stand here and speak to you directly, and enough sense to know that a man who needs to threaten women and kidnap loyal family members has already lost whatever power he once believed he held." A murmur passed through Conti's men, quickly silenced by a sharp look from their employer, but Elena caught the flicker of doubt that had crossed several faces at her words, the first crack in the wall of intimidation Conti had spent years building around himself. "Careful," Conti warned, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Words like that have gotten braver people than you killed." "Then kill me," Elena said, refusing to back down, even as she felt Damien tense beside her, ready to intervene. "And watch every piece of evidence Simon has given us reach the authorities within the hour, along with every business partner you have left. My death would not save you, Salvatore. It would simply guarantee your downfall arrives that much faster." "Perhaps," Elena replied, "but I also have something you do not expect. Proof." She nodded, almost imperceptibly, toward the shadows near the warehouse's side entrance, and on cue, 2 of Damien's men emerged, escorting between them a nervous, disheveled figure that Conti's face immediately recognized with dawning horror. Simon, the accountant they had quietly removed months earlier, the man who had been feeding information to Conti's organization from within the Rossi household. "He has been talking," Elena continued, watching the color drain from Conti's face, "about every shipment he redirected, every route he leaked, every payment he received from your organization over the past 2 years. Enough evidence to bring down not just this operation tonight, but every business you have built your reputation on." "That changes nothing," Conti snarled, though his confidence had visibly faltered. "I still have your wife's freedom to bargain with." "No," Damien said, stepping forward, his voice carrying a finality that silenced the warehouse. "You have men who are outnumbered 3 to 1, positioned exactly where we wanted them, and evidence that will destroy you the moment it reaches the wrong hands. You have nothing left to bargain with, Salvatore. The only question now is whether you walk away from this warehouse or whether you do not." The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity, Conti's eyes flicking between Damien's calm certainty and the men positioned throughout the shadows, clearly recalculating odds that had shifted dramatically against him. Finally, with a bitter, defeated expression, he gestured for his men to release Victor, who stumbled forward into the arms of Damien's guards, bruised but alive. "This is not over," Conti said, retreating toward the far exit with the remnants of his dignity. "It is over," Damien said firmly. "The moment you threatened my wife, you lost whatever leverage you believed you had. Touch her again, touch anyone in my family again, and the evidence Simon has given us will be the least of your concerns." Conti disappeared into the darkness beyond the warehouse doors, and the tension in the room broke all at once, Damien's men moving quickly to secure the area, while Victor was helped toward a waiting car, already receiving medical attention for the bruises along his face and ribs. Damien turned to Elena the moment the immediate danger had passed, his composure finally cracking entirely as he pulled her into his arms, with a desperation that surprised them both. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice muffled against her hair. "I have never been so afraid in my entire life." "I told you," Elena said, her own voice unsteady now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade. "I trusted you. I trusted us." "I do not deserve that trust," Damien said, pulling back just enough to look at her properly, his eyes bright with an emotion he had spent years learning to hide. "Not after how this began. Not after what I said to you at our wedding." "That was 3 months ago," Elena said softly. "You are not the same man who said those words. I have watched you become someone else entirely, someone I did not expect to find inside the coldness you showed the world." "Is it enough?" Damien asked, his voice barely audible over the sound of the harbor waves against the warehouse's foundations. "Everything I have tried to become since that night. Is it enough to earn what I do not deserve?" Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for the fear and uncertainty she found there, so different from the cold composure he had worn at their wedding, and something in her chest finally, fully, softened. "Ask me again," she said quietly, "when we are safely home, and Conti's threat is truly behind us. Tonight, I only want to know that you are safe, and that Victor is safe, and that this nightmare is finally, truly over." Damien nodded, pulling her close once more as his men finished securing the warehouse around them, and as they walked together back toward the waiting car, Elena allowed herself, for the first time since that humiliating night at the altar, to believe that whatever came next for them might finally be something worth holding on to. Back at the estate, Victor was seen immediately by the family physician, his injuries confirmed to be painful but not severe, and by the time the sun began to rise over the gardens, the household had settled into the particular quiet that follows a crisis, narrowly survived, exhausted relief mixed with the slow process of accounting for everything that had nearly been lost. Elena sat beside Damien in the study as dawn light crept through the windows, neither of them speaking, simply grateful to be alive and together after a night that could so easily have ended in tragedy. "I keep thinking about what you said in the warehouse," Damien said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "That you are not a piece to be traded. I do not think I fully understood until tonight how true that has always been, or how much I have come to depend on the woman standing beside me rather than the obligation I once believed I had married." "We make a good team," Elena said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "The best I have ever had," Damien agreed, and as the sun rose fully over the estate, casting warm golden light across the room where they sat together, Elena felt, for the first time since the wedding, that the worst of their trials might finally be behind them. 3 months to the day since her wedding, Elena stood in the same garden where she and Damien had first spoken honestly about her father's debt, a suitcase packed and waiting by the door of her room upstairs, though she had not yet decided whether she would ever actually carry it out to the car. The danger from Salvatore Conti had truly ended in the weeks following the warehouse confrontation, the evidence gathered from Simon's testimony enough to fracture Conti's alliances beyond repair, leaving him isolated and stripped of the power he had once wielded so confidently. The Rossi estate had returned, slowly, to something resembling peace, the guards relaxing their constant vigilance, the household settling back into ordinary rhythms. But peace, Elena had discovered, brought its own kind of reckoning. Without the constant threat of danger to occupy every waking moment, She had finally allowed herself to sit with the full weight of everything that had happened since her wedding day. The humiliation, the fear, the slow, complicated unraveling of trust that had followed. And in that stillness, she had found herself uncertain, for the first time in months, of what she actually wanted. She had spent the previous evening sitting alone by the window in her room, watching the same gardens she had once found so cold and unfamiliar, now bathed in the soft glow of early autumn light, and asking herself honestly whether the man downstairs had truly become someone different, or whether she had simply grown so accustomed to his presence that she had stopped questioning it as closely as she once had. She thought of her father, of the quiet dignity with which he had faced his own difficult choices, and she wondered what he would have made of the marriage he had unknowingly set into motion, whether he would have seen in Damien the same complicated, wounded man Elena had come to know, or whether he would have urged her to walk away, the moment the danger passed, and take back whatever remained of the life she had been meant to live before all of this began. She had not reached an answer by morning, only a growing certainty that she needed to hear the truth from Damien directly, without the shadow of danger or obligation clouding either of their judgment, before she could decide anything further about the shape her life would take from this point forward. Damien found her in the garden that afternoon, his expression carrying the particular caution of a man who suspected, correctly, that something significant was about to happen. "Lucia told me you asked her to help pack your things," he said quietly, standing a careful distance away, as though giving her room to retreat if she needed it. "I did," Elena confirmed, not turning to face him immediately. "May I ask why?" Damien's voice was steady, but Elena could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. She finally turned to look at him, searching for the right words to explain something she had only partially untangled herself. "Everything that happened between us these past 3 months," she said slowly, "happened because we were fighting for survival together. Every conversation, every trust we built, it was forged under pressure, under threat. I need to know if what exists between us is real, or if it was simply two people clinging to each other because the alternative was facing danger alone." Damien absorbed this in silence for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. "That is fair," he said finally. "I cannot prove to you, in a single conversation, that what I feel is real rather than circumstance. But I can tell you what I know to be true, and you can decide for yourself whether it is enough." He crossed the distance between them slowly, stopping close enough that she could see every flicker of emotion crossing his face. Emotions he had spent years learning to hide from everyone, emotions he no longer seemed interested in hiding from her. "The night of our wedding," he said, "I told myself I was protecting you by calling you nobody in front of everyone we knew. I have told myself many things over the years, Elena, to justify the coldness my father taught me to wear like armor. But the truth is simpler and far less flattering. I was afraid. I had spent my entire life believing that caring for someone meant giving them the power to destroy me, and I could not bear the thought of a stranger, a woman I had never chosen, holding that kind of power over me. And now?" Elena asked softly. "Now I understand that the power was never something you took from me," Damien said. "It was something I gave, freely, the moment I began trusting your judgment over my own instincts, the moment I began seeking you out, simply because I wanted your company, rather than because circumstance demanded it. I did not fall in love with you because we were surviving a war together, Elena. I fell in love with you despite my every attempt to prevent it, because you refused to let me hide behind the coldness that has defined every relationship in my life, until you arrived." Elena felt her resolve, so carefully constructed over the preceding days, begin to waver. "You hurt me," she said, her voice thick with emotion she had been holding back for months. "Not just at the wedding. Every day afterward that you kept me at a distance, that you decided things about my safety without consulting me, that you allowed me to feel like an obligation rather than a person." "I know," Damien said, and to her surprise, he lowered himself onto one knee before her, not as a proposal, but as a plea, his composure finally, completely abandoned. "I am not asking you to forget any of that, Elena. I am asking you to forgive it, not because I deserve it, but because I am willing to spend every day proving that I have changed, for as long as it takes for you to believe it." "Actions," Elena said quietly, echoing words she had spoken to him weeks earlier, in the darkness of the harbor warehouse. Not words. You told me that yourself. In a way, that night. That change has to be proven, not simply declared. Then let me prove it, Damien said, rising to his feet, but keeping his eyes locked on hers, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability written plainly across his face. Not today, with words, but tomorrow, and every day after, with the way I treat you, the way I listen to you, the way I make certain you never again feel like nobody in any room we enter together. Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing everything she had learned about this complicated, guarded man over the past 3 months, weighing the humiliation of their wedding against the countless small moments since then, when he had chosen her judgment, her safety, her happiness, over the cold instincts his father had spent a lifetime instilling in him. I will stay, she said finally, watching relief flood across his face before she continued, holding up a hand to stop him from speaking further. But not because I have forgiven you completely, not yet. I will stay, because I believe you are capable of becoming the man you are describing, and because some part of me, despite everything, wants to see if you can actually become him. That is more than I hoped for, Damien said, his voice rough with emotion. Do not disappoint me, Elena said, though a small, genuine smile had begun to soften the seriousness of her expression. I do not intend to, Damien said, reaching for her hand, and this time, when their fingers intertwined, there was nothing calculated or forced about the gesture, only two people who had survived a war together, and chosen, finally, to build something real from what remained. They walked back toward the house together, as the afternoon light began to soften into evening, and along the way, Damien paused near the same fountain where Elena had once found the forgotten photograph of his mother, half hidden beneath a fallen leaf. I know about the photograph, he said quietly, surprising her. Lucia told me she took it from you, months ago, worried it might upset me if I found it myself. Elena felt a flicker of guilt. I did not mean to intrude on something private. You did not intrude, Damien said. You found a piece of my life I had spent years trying to bury. I think, in a strange way, that photograph is part of why I have finally been able to speak about her at all. Knowing you had seen it, and had not judged me for the wound it represented, made it easier to imagine telling you the rest of the story someday, when I am ready. I would like that, Elena said softly, whenever you are ready. Soon, Damien promised. Not today, but soon. In the weeks that followed, Elena watched Damien keep his promise in small, deliberate ways that meant more to her than any grand gesture could have managed. He began introducing her at business meetings, not as his wife in passing, but as a partner whose judgment he valued, whose opinion he sought before making decisions that affected the family. He asked, rather than instructed, when matters concerned her safety or her preferences. He shared, slowly and haltingly, more of the fear and grief that had shaped him into the guarded man she had married, allowing her to see the parts of himself he had spent years hiding from everyone, including himself. Victor, who had witnessed the transformation from the very beginning, found Elena alone in the library one evening, several weeks after that conversation in the garden, and offered her a rare, genuine smile. I told you once that you had already repaid whatever debt this family believed you owed us, he said. I want you to know that I meant it more today than I did then. Whatever this family has become since you arrived, it is better for it. He is better for it. Thank you, Victor, Elena said, genuinely touched. That means more than you know. Lucia found her in the kitchen that same afternoon, humming quietly to herself as she helped prepare the evening meal, a lightness in her movements that had not been there in the difficult weeks following the wedding. You seem different today, Lucia observed, watching her with a knowing smile. I feel different, Elena admitted. I think, for the first time since I arrived in this house, I finally feel like I belong here, not because circumstance demands it, but because I have chosen it for myself. That is the difference between surviving a life and truly living one, Lucia said wisely, setting a fresh loaf of bread on the counter between them. I watched Damien's mother survive this house for 12 years, before she finally could not bear it any longer. I have watched you, in 3 short months, transform it into something she never managed to find here. I do not know what that says about fate, or about the two of you, but I know it is worth honoring. Elena thought of the old photograph she had found in the garden all those months ago, still tucked safely away in a drawer in her room, and she felt a quiet ache of sympathy for the woman who had once stood in this same kitchen, perhaps feeling as lost and uncertain as Elena herself had felt in those first difficult weeks. She hoped, wherever that woman had gone, that she had eventually found the peace this house had never offered her. That evening, as the sun set behind the estate walls in shades of gold and amber, Elena found Damien waiting for her, in the same garden where their fragile new beginning had taken root weeks earlier. He said nothing as she approached, simply reaching for her hand and drawing her close, and for a long moment, they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the light fade over the gardens that had once felt so cold and unfamiliar, and now, slowly, were beginning to feel like something closer to home. 3 months ago, Damien said quietly, I stood at an altar and called you nobody in front of everyone I know, because I was too afraid to admit what I already sensed even then, that you were going to change everything about how I understood strength and love and what it truly means to protect the people who matter most. And now? Elena asked, echoing the question she had asked him weeks before. Now, Damien said, turning to face her fully, his eyes carrying none of the coldness that had once defined every interaction between them. I know exactly who you are. You are Elena Rossi. You are the reason I have finally become someone worth forgiving. And you are, without question, the single most important person in my entire life. Elena felt tears she had refused to shed since her wedding day finally rise to the surface, not from pain this time, but from something far gentler, the quiet, hard-won relief of watching a broken promise, slowly, carefully, be rebuilt into something true. She did not know, standing there in the fading golden light, whether every wound from those first humiliating months would ever fully heal. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she wanted to stay and find out, not because circumstance demanded it, but because she had finally chosen it for herself. Then prove it to me, she said softly, echoing his own words back to him one final time. Every single day, for as long as we both shall live. Every single day, Damien promised, and as he drew her into his arms beneath the darkening sky, Elena finally allowed herself to believe, completely and without reservation, that the nobody he had called her at their wedding had, against every expectation, become the woman who had taught him how to truly love. Months later, when Elena thought back on the night of her wedding, the humiliation that had once felt like the defining moment of her entire life, she found that the memory no longer carried the same sharp sting it once had. It had become, instead, simply the beginning of a story she had not expected to live, one that had asked more of her than she believed herself capable of giving, and had, in turn, given her back something she had never thought to hope for, from a marriage built on debt and obligation. She kept the old photograph of Damien's mother framed now, in a small corner of their shared study, a quiet reminder of the wound that had shaped the man she loved, and of how far he had come in learning to close it, rather than let it consume everyone who tried to get close to him. Lucia often remarked, with quiet satisfaction, that the estate itself seemed different now, warmer somehow, filled with a life it had not held in years. Elena did not know what challenges still waited for them in the months and years ahead, running a family whose business would always carry certain dangers, whose enemies would never entirely disappear. But she knew, with a certainty that had grown steadily since that first cruel night at the altar, that whatever came, she would not face it as nobody, and she would not face it alone.